The Christian scriptures are a strange amalgam of stories and teachings. There's not much high philosophy. There's a great deal of deep theology embedded in these stories and in these sayings of the scriptures. But the majority of Christians, I think, are not people who we think of ourselves as Christians, whatever that really means. We perhaps don't spend much time with the scriptures. Maybe because, for the older generation anyway, we were exposed to it so much in a cultural way at church or in school that we didn't ever really meet the scriptures directly, personally. And it's a pity, really, because I think a lot of people struggle with their religious identity, or feel it's not formed, or don't know even what it means, simply because they've never really spent any time with these scriptures. And this is perhaps an opportunity today just to zoom in on a couple of short passages which might help us to see how rich these wisdom documents are, how strange they are, how very mysterious they are, how very compact and concentrated they are. They're not, long philosophical texts, the innumerable commentaries on them, but the texts themselves just are there. They're just there. And they emerged from an oral tradition, of course, about 150 years ago. Most of them were written 100 years after Jesus. So they're not eyewitness accounts in the normal sense in which you'd expect breaking news on CNN to give you an eyewitness account of, something that's just happened. And so these are texts that became texts only after they had been orally transmitted and shared and memorized, probably, so that they really sank into the minds and being of those early seekers. And of course, they are all in translation. We don't have the direct words of Jesus or of his disciples. It's written in Greek. Probably the first Gospels were written in Aramaic or spoken in Aramaic. So they're a rather strange group of writings. Some of them almost like letters, like the letters of St. Paul, including local news or referring to conflicts or people of whom we only have scraps of knowledge. That's what we know about them, then certain names and certain conflicts probably in the early Christian communities that were quite intense at the time, but we've completely lost the thread now. We don't know what the actual details were. So they're a strange amalgam, and yet somehow or other these texts produce an energy and a wisdom that we can find immensely enlightening, and that can open us to the deeper levels of the meaning of our own lives, of our own existence. The way I think to encounter the scriptures is not by looking at them as if it was a newspaper article and we have to form an opinion about them. And then you get little by people writing in, what do you call it, online articles telling you what they thought about it. But it's not, they're not really reports in the ordinary sense of the word. They're much more interactive. It's at a level, they work at a level of consciousness that is much more subtle and personal than that kind of objective reporting. So we'll see as we look at these two accounts in Luke and Matthew, is just how different they are, actually. Where was Jesus born? What were the circumstances of his birth? Very different accounts. So, because of the discrepancy, we might say, well, let's throw this out of court because the witnesses are do not agree with each other. But it depends whether you are reading these as a sort of these accounts in order to disprove them, or if you're reading them in order to be convinced, because you'd like to be convinced, because your life would be easier if you could have this sort of rock-solid conviction based on real evidence. Then life would be more simple. You'd have this fundamentalist conviction. But neither of those approaches is really really works. It's not how we interact with these scriptures. And I think the space that meditation creates, which is a space without images, without words, and without opinion, not without faith, in the sense of deeper meaning of faith, but meditation creates that space within our minds that allows the scriptures to operate as they are meant to work, as they are meant to touch us, stimulate us, teach us, and befriend us. These are, after all, friendly documents, or friendly words, passed down in a great tradition for a good purpose, which is not just to fill churches with worshippers, but to enlighten humanity. So, and we're beneficiaries of that mysterious and benevolent communication. So we need, I think, that contemplative dimension of mind to be able to taste the wisdom which the scriptures are communicating. The word wisdom itself in Latin, sapientia, comes from the word sapere, which is to taste. So wisdom is something that we taste rather than conceptually agree with or disagree with. It's a taste. You don't argue with the taste of salt. You don't say, does it taste like salt or does it not taste like salt? It is salt. So wisdom has that immediacy and self-authenticating reality about it. So the scriptures have that kind of wisdom too. They carry an experience that is direct and true in itself. And of course, as with any experience, we can and we should, in fact, question it and share it and discuss it and see if we can verify it. But the experience itself is vital. Without the experience, we're just dealing with conceptual theory. Anyway, in this session, before we meditate, I'd like to take a little time to look at the Gospel of Luke and look at the question of meaning. What is meaning? What is the meaning of life? What's the meaning of this great loss that I've just experienced in my life? What is the meaning of this child I mean, a real child, a child that's just been born to my family. What is the meaning? I was asked to do a baptism earlier this year, and the couple, I think, had asked me because they thought I'd be easier to than ask so many questions as the parish priest. And but I did ask them, why do you want little Jason baptized? And they looked at me as if I'd asked them the most earth-shattering question. So eventually they said, well, we had the other one baptized. Couldn't argue with that. And but when they said we had the christening, and the church was filled with their friends, all in their late 20s or 30s probably, and all dressed up and really, into it. But so I thought, well, let's talk about the meaning of it. Why are we doing this? What is the meaning of this act? Is it just a sort of social, cultural thing? It is. Is it just that, though? Is it just doing what you did to the other child and making them respectable in some way, or giving a social acceptance to this new being? So we seek meaning in the great events of life, birth or death, or marriage or divorce, or happiness or grief, the light and shade of life. Inevitably, we seek the meaning of it, and and the meaning is not just a simple or obvious explanation. If we could capture the meaning in a formula, or in a creed even, or in a definition, or in a computer printout, life would be, well, maybe more simple, but it would be less rich. But we can't capture meaning just as we cannot capture wisdom. It's something that has to be experienced. And when the big events of life touch us, and we know that this is a life-changing moment, I will not be the same after this if I survive it, which we usually do. It may seem as if we won't, but we usually do. But I will be different, and I will see the world differently after this. So meaning is something that has to be tasted, has to be experienced. And the faculty by which we experience it or taste it is a deeper level of consciousness. So we're always plunged to a deeper place within ourselves, from which we are at first rather inexperienced. And at this deeper level of consciousness, we don't quite know how to articulate or to express the meaning that we are now engaging with. But we do become more familiar with those deeper levels of consciousness. I mean, if our lives are in any way deepening, growing in wisdom, then that should be happening. Doesn't mean we have the answers to everything. It doesn't mean we will still not be taken by surprise or caught off guard, as Mary was in this story, at the moment of the Annunciation. But it doesn't mean we're on top of everything, but it does mean that we are able to engage with the meaning of life from a more experienced place, a more familiar position. And if we, this meaning, this ability to experience meaning, is essential really for our survival in certain extreme circumstances. the survivors of the concentration camps seem to have been those, on the whole, according to many of the survivors themselves, who had this level of meaning, that they had not just something to live for, because actually pretty well everything they had been stripped away from them, but they had this depth of perception that was able to remain open even in the most inhumane suffering. So meaning does allow us to survive and even to integrate experiences that would otherwise seem to be meaningless or destructive. When we read these scriptures, we might say, what's the real meaning of it? What's the literal sense? And immediately we come up against a modern dilemma, because, as I said before, these aren't newspaper reports. The scriptures are not written by journalists you can trust. What we have to ask is really, what did the writer intend? Rather than looking for literal historical reporting, we need to ask, what was the intention of these words when they were first put together? And what's the meaning of what I'm saying now? What's the meaning of any conversation we'll have over lunch or over Christmas dinner? It depends upon the context. Different audiences will relate to different words or different stories in many different ways. But perhaps meaning above all for the people who wrote these stories and people who know the scriptures is found in patterns. And we live today in a rather episodic kind of consciousness, very much under pressure, very much moving from one demand or one thing to do to another, under a lot of, for many of us, under stressful and demanding conditions, in which survival, keeping our job or keeping on top of our job or keeping our reputation is very important, necessary. So we often don't have time or space to be aware of the patterns in our lives. We just jump from one crisis to another. But as soon as we allow that meditative space to open up in our lives, we do begin to be aware of patterns and connections. Again, this doesn't come as simplistic answers to all the questions and problems we have in life. But the patterns become perceptible. They're not necessarily fixed patterns, because something could happen tomorrow that would change the pattern and the meaning of our life. So we live in a certain state of suspense, like from one episode of a thriller series to another. And but the patterns are constantly in formation, and yet they have a consistency about them as well. Another understanding of these early scriptures is about the idea of fulfillment. We all would like to have fulfilled lives. Emotionally fulfilled, professionally satisfying. We would like to feel that our lives were not empty. But the idea of fulfillment goes deeper than this sense of personal satisfaction or personal achievement. What if fulfillment actually touched into our common human nature? What if we could not be fulfilled just as individuals, just by getting the job I wanted or having the marriage I dreamed of having? But what if fulfillment, not ignoring that personal level, But what if fulfillment actually was only to be found in at a deeper level where we are connected to each other? Whereas human beings, today we sense ourselves as one human family in a way that would have been quite foreign perhaps to our ancestors. Perhaps Jesus, more than anybody in history, has helped to be the catalyst for an understanding of the oneness of humanity. Who is my neighbor? Was the question he responded to. And if a Samaritan, or let's say a Palestinian, could be a true neighbor to an Israeli, then doesn't that change the picture of humanity? It's easy to say, here we are living in a certain ethnic, well, so London is a pretty multi-ethnic and multicultural group of people living together. But what if we could really look upon the stranger, the foreigner, the non-believer, or that person who believed differently, somebody of a different sexual orientation, somebody of a different social class, and yet look at them and know that we were connected, and that connection was fundamental. I couldn't deny that connection. And that connection we are equal, however big the differences or gaps between us. So that's where fulfillment begins to really become significant and meaningful. And the scriptures, I think, are concerned with that level of human fulfillment. So we read, of course, this time of the year in this liturgical season of the fulfillment of the prophecies. And that's how the scripture writers work. They were dealing with the Hebrew scriptures, and they were reading them and making patterns of fulfillment between these scriptures written hundreds of years before and what they were discovering in their own experience of faith in Jesus. So I think we could say this has deepened since then. That the seed of fulfillment has fallen even deeper into the soil of human consciousness. We're still fighting each other, we're still persecuting each other, we're still treating others different from ourselves as if they were aliens, yet, in many parts of the world, and yet this experience of fulfillment together in unity is, I hope, growing. Then the other aspect of meaning is very personal, very subjective in a way. What does this story mean to me? What does it do and touch in me at this particular moment on the 21st of December? What does it tell me now about the meaning of my life? So in the Gospel of Luke, we have a strange, it's a very sophisticated kind of piece of writing, in fact, written in sort of good scholarly Greek, an very intelligent work of literature. And in the opening chapters, there is a parallelism between John the Baptist and Jesus. John the Baptist and Jesus are both announced before their conception or before their birth. There are two annunciations. One to the parents of John the Baptist, we won't go into that, And the other, a famous one, probably on about a quarter of our Christmas cards, if you still get religious Christmas cards, of the Angel Gabriel. In the 6th month, the Angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. He went in and said to her, "Rejoice, so highly favored. The Lord is with you." She was deeply disturbed by these words and asked herself what this greeting could mean. So, Mary is trying to find out the meaning of what happens as well. She's deeply disturbed by this experience. Now again, there's something very particular and concrete about these few words, this story, and yet what lies behind it, what actual historical moment. There's a beautiful painting by Pontormo in Florence, in one of the churches, of Mary, this young girl, walking up some stairs, and she's turning like this. One foot is still raised, waiting to touch the next step, and she's turning like this, her head behind her, and there is the angel. So it's a moment of what? Annunciation. It's a moment of insight, a moment of recognition, a moment where your name is called in a moment that you don't expect. You're, I don't know, going down the escalator at Angel Gabriel tube station, and then you suddenly hear your name called. You turn around. Is it me? Is it this Laurence, or is it some other Laurence? And so it's that moment, instantaneous moment of connection, of recognition. So this is the Annunciation. And it immediately fills her with a certain dread, fear. This is something bigger than her, something potentially overwhelming. And the first thing that the angel says, angels must have the ability to read our minds, is, "Do not be afraid, Mary." Uses her name, calls her by name. Makes a big difference when you're not, somebody doesn't point at you and just say, "Hey, you, come over here," but calls you by name. And then, even though you are disturbed by this moment of being singled out, and called out of the crowd, and suddenly put on the spot, and feeling a bit vulnerable and exposed, then that same person or same force that calls you out into a new singularity, into a new identity almost, says, "Don't be scared. It's going to be okay. It's bigger than you are, but you don't have to be frightened of it." So doesn't this suggest something in the processes of human development? Annunciation happens in our lives. When we are touched in concrete moments, singled out, made to realize that we are unique. We'd rather not be sometimes, because it's safer to be in a crowd in Westfield. It's safer to be there because we're like everybody else. You get a football crowd, a stampede. But suddenly, to be made aware of our unique identity. I was talking to somebody quite recently who said that they had made several attempts to meditate in recent years and had given up each time because I said, was it too busy? And they said, no, it was just that I began to feel that it was taking me somewhere and giving me a sense of myself that was scary. And I just didn't have the confidence to go deeper. I was scared. I was frightened. So Mary's first reaction to this Annunciation, as ours often is when we are encountered by and called out by some event in life that brings us more closely and fully to ourselves, it was fear. Do not be afraid. You have won God's favor. Well, it's a pretty strong affirmation. Listen. It's a very important word in the scriptures. The first word of the rule of St. Benedict. Just listen. Just pay attention. Don't listen to your fears, which is what we normally listen to, but just listen to what is happening. Listen to the real event that is beginning to unfold now. You don't know where it's going to take you, but you can trust it. But you've got to listen to it. You've got to stay attentive. As in the same way we listen to our mantra. It puts us into this, not listening for a message in meditation. Not listening for a text message from God to say, don't forget the cranberry sauce. But it's a modality of being, it's a way of being in which our whole consciousness, including our body, is turned towards this communication, this event of life itself, coming towards us, engaging us, and opening us up to something bigger than we thought, bigger than we are. Just listen. You don't have to explain it. Just listen to it. And then he says, you are to conceive and bear a son, and you must name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. He will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and his reign will have no end. So that's a pretty big job description for a newly conceived child. And Mary says to the angel, kind of a very practical feminine response, but how can this happen? Because I'm still a virgin. The Holy Spirit will come upon you, the angel answered, and the power of the Most High will cover you with its shadow. So the child will be holy and will be called Son of God. So, in other words, what is happening now is different. This is something quite new. We all are looking for the next thing that's going to happen in our lives. Good or bad. Fulfilling our expectations or defeating our hopes. But we're all sort of waiting for the new thing to happen. And yet the new thing very rapidly becomes history. We absorb it, we cope with it, and then we wait for the next thing to happen. But here, we're being shown the possibility of something happening that is genuinely new, in the sense it will never become old. It can only be really new if it stays new. Otherwise, it's just a variation on the patterns of the past. But if there's a completely, really new eruption, or new pattern, or a new pattern of patterns emerging in our life, this is ultimate meaning, then it's always going to stay fresh. So the birth of Jesus, of course, has many levels at which you can talk about it, including the historical. But as Meister Eckhart and many of the great mystics have said, there is if the birth of Jesus does not happen in me, then the historical birth in Bethlehem is really not so significant. It has to happen in me as well. And then it becomes new and renewing, not just for me, but at that deepest level of human unity, human significance. So this is literally a world-shaking event, because it's revealing something and helping things to emerge in human understanding that will not shut down and become history or become outdated. This is something really new. Like God is always new. God is always younger than we are, as the mystics used to say. And then just sort of establishing this dualism, this parallelism with the Annunciation of John the Baptist. The angel says, "Know this, your kinswoman Elizabeth has in her old age herself conceived a son, and so you're not alone in this." The difference between the two, of course, is an old woman who has a baby late in life and surprising herself and everybody else, and a young maiden who, is who one expects to, hopes to have a child. So so here we see the old and the new here playing against each other in this literary pattern. And the meaning is focusing upon the newness, the youthfulness of the birth of Jesus. And then Mary's response, "I am the handmaid of the Lord." So it's kind of you could imagine a little Jewish shrug there. Okay. I don't understand what you're talking about, but it feels true. It feels nothing I can do about it anyway, really, except she does. She says, "Okay, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done unto me, that what you have said be done to me." And the angel leaves her. So this moment of Annunciation is time limited, but it was a significant event of awakening, of consciousness. Something new happened in that moment, but the angel's not there anymore. So now you have to work on this yourself. I was talking with somebody recently, and part of the community where we needed to do some rearrangement of leadership, and this woman said to me, "I am the servant of the Lord." This big smile. "I am the servant of the Lord." So I said, "Well, that's great, because we need a new person in a new position." And immediately the smile fell off. She didn't exactly say, "Well, I don't mean it literally." But here we see a genuine expression of aligning yourself with what has been announced, what has broken through in your consciousness. You trust, and you're going to stay with it. And so we see here in the Gospel of Luke that that Mary is the first disciple. She's the first disciple of Jesus. This is the deepest connection, really, between them. And then she, all of these stories you could spend hours with, but anyway, then she goes off to the hill country to meet Elizabeth, and was having John the Baptist, and John the Baptist leaps in her womb, and Mary comes into sight. So already John is announcing the coming of Jesus. So they're the same age, even related in Luke narrative. And again, the idea of fulfillment. Blessed, Elizabeth says, blessed is she who believed that the promise made her by the Lord will be fulfilled. So we have two pregnant women in that peculiar state of fulfillment, which that state gives, and that depth of being, where the two unborn children are sort of communicating with each other through the women. So quite deep and subtle levels of communication happening here. And then Mary, using the words of the Old Testament passage from the first book of Samuel, the Song of Hannah, gives vent to this great song we call the Magnificant. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. Well, a fundamental shift of consciousness has happened here when we can say that. My soul and myself is proclaiming that the Lord is great, not that I am great. So my center of attention has truly shifted to one of worship, not of self-fulfillment, but of fulfillment, beyond anything I could call myself. And my attention is drawn towards the source of this being, the source of this amazing Annunciation. And my spirit exults in God, my Saviour. So I know that I'm joyful. When we're really joyful, do we know it? Well, we know it and we don't know it. As soon as you begin to analyze or examine it too closely, it begins to diminish. Because you begin to say, I wonder how long this will last. I wonder what's going to happen. Maybe it will be threatened by something. So as soon as we begin to be self-conscious, self-analytical, and therefore possessive about this experience of joy, of fulfillment, it begins to recede. But real joy, you see this in a child who is absolutely blissful in certain moments, or in ourselves, hopefully still. There is an awareness that there is joy in us. Some time ago I was meeting with a group of people who wanted to start a meditation group, and after, they were all of them, most of them new to meditation, and after the meditation, one of the men said to me, how long was the meditation? I said, about 20 minutes. And he said, well, that's interesting, it could have been 20 seconds or 20 days. So I had no idea that this was waiting for me this evening when I came from work. And he said, I just, not only the sense of time, but he said what happened in the meditation. He said, I did what you said. I said the word, and I found myself somewhere I'd never been before. And he said, I can't really find words to describe it. It's just completely joyful, blissful. He was really stumbling for words. But he'd obviously had a little enunciation. And he was sideswiped by it completely. he knew it was his experience, but at the same time, he had no control or understanding of it. So there was a kind of objectivity about it. It happened to him, or it happened in him. He didn't make it happen. He wasn't using some technique. He had no idea how it happened. And so then he said, just to finish that story, which some of you heard, he says, even more amazing, he said, is the fact I had the most terrible day you could imagine. I'd been in a foul mood all day. I'd been hateful to everybody, and I hated myself, and I just wanted to go home. I came here this evening, and this is what I meet. This is what I find. So nothing shows more clearly that what we would say in these terms is contemplation is a grace, it's a gift. You don't earn it. I mean, I'd been a much nicer person all day than he had been, probably, and I didn't get that from anybody else. So we don't control this at all. And that feeling of it being from beyond us, it's not something we ingest in order to bring about a certain result. Then we're in control. We know that we pop this pill, we take this thing, we're going to get a certain, maybe a good or a bad trip, but we're going to get something out of it. But this is something completely outside of that cause and effect system. So Mary expresses this abundance of joy, and she does so in a way that has been used by liberation theologians in South America, particularly for the last few decades, to drive a theology of liberation. Because what she describes is a complete overturning of our usual expectations of fulfillment and power. Normally, we feel that if we're going to be fulfilled, we need to be in control in some way, have our handle on the wheel. And that's how society is built, interlocking power systems. And what this experience, this annunciation, shows us through Mary here, is that actually is not the bottom line. That is not the real truth. That the power systems on which we depend for the expectation of our fulfillment are actually very brittle and impermanent and unreliable. They collapse, like political success or financial success or social success, even emotional success at times, they crash. And there is, however, a reality built upon this, not built upon, but expressing this complete freedom and gratuitousness or gracefulness or generosity that has no way of being packaged or controlled or hijacked or manipulated. It is just the Spirit of God, or however you want to describe it. So the bottom line, the ultimate truth, is this stream of pure generosity. And that overturns the power structures of our lives. He's pulled down princes from their thrones and exalted the lowly. The hungry he has filled with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. So this experience is changing the world. What has been announced has the potential to give us a new understanding of reality and of human society. Finally, we'll just fast forward a little bit. We'll look at the birth of Jesus after meditation. But how does Mary, what do we see in Mary? A very important figure in the story and in the Gospels and in the mind of the early church, and yet a rather silent and modest figure. In fact, even more than that, what we see in these passages is Mary completely overwhelmed by what is happening, accepting it, and yet not understanding it. So what do you do then when you have something happens to you? There's an enunciation of reality that over which you have no control, but which you can accept. You can go with it rather than what? Denying it, running away from it, pretending it's not there. I mean, that's another option. You just deny or you distract yourself, befuddle your mind, rather than facing the new horizon, the new perspective that's opened up in your life. But what do you do then when you don't understand it? The meaning has hit you like a double-decker bus, but you don't understand it. Well, what we learn from Mary's response is you ponder it. The translation is different, but in some translations this, she treasured it in her heart. But it also has the sense of a deep reflection, rather than trying to analyze it and solve it. There's the sense of pondering it, keeping it conscious, keeping in touch with its meaning, without feeling that you've got to explain it. And that's what allows it to grow. I mean, I don't think there's any way yet that we are able, say, to speed up the 9 months of pregnancy. There's no way to do it. You can't say, it's amazing actually, when you think about it. It's the one thing we can't sort of speed up. You can nourish it and you can, enjoy it, as people seem to do. But you can't speed it up. You have to just let it grow. One of those things we don't have ultimate control over. It's a mighty force, but it's also very fragile. It gives great joy, but it also makes you feel very vulnerable. So, in the same way, we could say, if this birth of Jesus has to happen in us, just as it once happened historically, then there's going to be a process, beginning with Annunciation, beginning with some kind of breakthrough and understanding, some sense of being touched, connected with, invited. This may take years or decades before we get it. But in the process then, there has to be a gestation or a formation. This is what St. Paul, many years later after this, calls allowing Christ to form in you. And his work, trying to build these conflicting, arguing Middle Eastern communities, was to help Christ to form in them, as he had clearly felt Christ had formed in him. And our meditation, I think, is very much a way in which at that deepest level understanding, we ponder this mystery, and we give it the space and the time needed to grow. So let's do that now. Let's just take 5 minutes. Some of you need to stretch your legs or go to the toilet. But let's stay quiet for these 5 minutes, and then we'll ring the bell in 5 minutes.